So with the VE Day 75th anniversary commemorations, notwithstanding the lockdown, it's very much been on my mind. And I think it was still had quite a resonant effect on the public mind across the country. In fact, there were reports that some people broke the social distancing rules to take part in street parties of sorts. Um, in a way, World War Two has very much been on my mind, but particularly the European theatre of World War Two. Um, and I thought it would be timely to make a video about the subject of the Allied bombing of German cities. Now, this is a very controversial subject. It's a contentious subject, and I don't know what the monetization situation would be like. So I'm not going to use any profanity, YouTube. I'm not going to show any gory images, and I'm just expressing my views on a topical issue. Um, so we know that both the RAF, Bomber Command within the RAF, and the American Air Force carried out numerous raids on German cities throughout the war. We also know that British and French cities suffered bombing raids in the war, and indeed Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And the Rotterdam bombing was particularly heavy. That was this day it causes quite a bit of resentment in the Netherlands, I believe, along with the great hunger that the Dutch experienced, basically a famine. Um, Up to 30,000 Dutch civilians died in that. Um, Before I talk about any of this, there's one very, very important thing that has to be remembered about this subject, and it's this. World War Two was a total war in which everyone was involved somehow. Everyone. If they weren't serving in their respective armed forces, they were part of it. You could not escape the reach this conflict had. So in that sense, it was a total war involving every aspect of society, every aspect of our our national identity, our national, and I'm saying this for other countries as well. It was a total war. Different, for example, from modern conflicts where we do have the tragic death of servicemen and women, but it doesn't have the sort of sweeping effect on the civilian population. So, for example, when we know about the soldiers who died in the Falklands, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, um, the civilians indeed who suffered in Northern Ireland as well, all tragic, but it didn't have the sweeping national impact two world wars had, and particularly World War Two for civilians. It's worth noting that the discrepancy between military deaths and civilian deaths for this country between World War Two and World War One is stark. World War One had significantly higher military fatalities, but World War Two had significantly higher civilian fatalities for the British. That is, there were actually some bombing raids on British cities in World War One, the Zeppelin raids, and they did kill a few thousand people, but it wasn't on the scale of the bombing of World War Two. And the bombing of British cities and of French cities. Incidentally, some of those French cities were bombed by the Allies because it was, of course, occupied France. Um, as much as there was profound suffering that we can't relate to today, that was small compared to the number of German civilians who died. And I'm not saying that as any sort of political point. I'm just saying it as a fact. It's what we know. So I'm going to quote some figures here as I've researched them. And this is from a variety of sources, Wikipedia, among other online sources and publications. So throughout the duration of World War Two, it's believed around 67,000 British civilians died in predominantly bombing raids. Of this, around 42,000 were during the Blitz. That is, I believe it was October 1940 to May 1941. So about two-thirds of the total number of deaths were during that initial Blitzkrieg. Other deaths occurred during the so-called Baedeker Blitz, which was deliberate attacks on cathedral cities like Exeter and Bath and York. And then there was the V2 raids, which some actually said were more scary than the Blitz itself, because with V2 bombs, apparently you couldn't hear them. We know of the famous Erie. air raid sirens during the Blitz. But with the V2 raids, the V2 rockets were apparently silent. Now, that's pretty chilling. And they say if you couldn't hear it, then you knew it was close. So that killed the remainder of civilians. We know that London's East End was utterly pulverised. We know that other industrial cities, particularly port cities like Belfast, Liverpool, Hull, were devastated. The bombing of Coventry is very widely documented, but Coventry wasn't even the second most bombed city. I mean, it was symbolic because the cathedral, became an icon of the Blitz. But many British cities were hit hard. Sheffield was hit hard. Manchester was hit hard. Plymouth and Portsmouth both hit hard. Southampton, Cardiff. I mean, the list goes on. And it's estimated 67,000 people. Here in Sunderland, 267 people died. Sunderland was an important port. And this is actually, I've got a book on the Sunderland Blitz. No copyright infringement intended. This is like a local history book by Kevin Brady. And there's an interesting photo here. This is a German reconnaissance photo of the port of Sunderland from the air. And you can see the piers there, that's up at Roker and Seaburn. Sunderland doesn't look much different today, except we have high-rise buildings today. Well, car blocks. But it's booked entirely on the Sunderland Blitz. So, without question, the British people suffered. And it's worth looking at how this compares to the coronavirus because we've currently had 32,000 deaths. So if this goes on by the end of the year, more people could have actually died from COVID-19 than in bombing raids during World War II, which would be symbolically quite something. Already more people have died in Sunderland and South Tyneside NHS Trust from coronavirus than from the World War II air raids. So, like I say, in Sunderland, the figure was 267 in the Sunderland Blitz. We've already lost 292 from coronavirus, so that's quite symbolic. Um, but like I say, they're different kinds of disasters. I think it's hard to compare them because with air raids, there's instant violent death. With coronavirus, it's more prolonged. It's a different kind of suffering, but it is suffering. And, make no mistake, each of those 32,000 people had loved ones who are suffering, so we really, really can't downplay this. Um, but to get to the main point of this video, the air raids on Germany. Now, this is a very controversial issue because um, there is one school of thought that says, how can the Allies be triumphalists when they deliberately killed German civilians? Let's start with a fact. German civilians died. And another fact is they died in much greater numbers than British or French civilians during the air raids. I don't mean French civilians overall, I mean during the air raids. But 67,000 British civilians. The figures for German civilians could be up to 500,000. There's no exact data on this because of wartime records are not complete, but it's certainly much, much higher. And the total German fatalities in World War II are massive. They go in the many millions. In fact, I believe Germany had the fourth highest death rate in World War II. It was the Soviet Union, China, Poland, then Germany. So remember, Germany was fighting on two major fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Yes, we were also involved in other fronts in North Africa, in Asia, but Germany really was being pulverized on both fronts, especially the Eastern Front. I mean, German fatalities on the Eastern Front were horrendous. Um, and that just shows how profound the Soviet fatalities were when they were even higher. So that's very poignant. And of course, Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian civilians. But I'm going to quote some figures that have been cited for German cities during World War II, and then I'll get on to my thoughts on this. So, Hamburg alone, in bombing raids throughout the war, Hamburg, Germany's second city, Germany's major port, 42,000 civilian deaths. That's staggering. Well, I say civilian deaths, there may have been military deaths there as well, but 42,000 people. It's a huge figure. That's like the entire total for the Blitz on Britain in one city, 42,000. Dresden, of course, very controversial. Median figures 30,000, but figures as high as 70,000 have been suggested. German sources actually go for the more conservative figure of 30,000. Nevertheless, a lot of people. Cologne, 22,000. Berlin, between 20 and 50,000. This is deaths, this is not casualties. That's not including the wounded and homeless. The small city of Forsheim, about 17,000 people. And Forsheim, it's a small place, it's only got 120,000 people. Um, I believe it was in the rural region. I believe it was an industrial city. But pretty much every major German city suffered at least one deadly bombing raid. Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, um, they all suffered. Munich. So the exact figures we'll probably never know for sure, but they were certainly much, much higher than the fatalities in Britain. And needless to say, the mainland United States didn't suffer at all in bombing raids. There was, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the mainland United States really didn't suffer. There was suffering in the sense that, of course, people lost loved ones, servicemen who died on the front. But the suffering on the mainland United States really was minimal compared to what went on in Europe. Um, so I think there's very much this thing in the German psyche about how they deal with the war. Basically, there is, of course, the enormous guilt, and immediately after World War II, after the deadly Battle of Berlin, one of the bloodiest battles in human history, intense, intense fighting in the Battle of Berlin. Thousands of German civilians commit suicide because they feared reprisals from the Soviet forces. Um, and I've heard it said that if a German, particularly German soldier, feared capture, um, they could have, if they were to be captured by the British, the Americans, or the Soviets, they would have chosen the British first because the British were most humane in the treatment of German POWs. Soviets, total war. The Soviet Union had been absolutely pulverized, humiliated, millions of civilian and military dead. So the reprisals were very real. It's estimated that tens of thousands of German women were raped in the months and years after World War II by all Allied forces, but particularly the Soviets. And there were different approaches to this. Um, we know about the some reprisals by servicemen in the liberation of the concentration camps. In some ways, I think that's more understandable than the mass rape of German women, because German women were civilians. Nazi commandants at the concentration camps had committed the most evil things imaginable. So I'm less judgmental of some of those reprisals than I am of the reprisals on German civilians. Because one thing that must be remembered is that this was a dictatorship and German civilians couldn't exactly just oppose Hitlerism and the Third Reich. So that aspect needs to be remembered. Many Germans didn't have a choice. This doesn't mean that they're guilt free. Of course, it doesn't. There was enthusiastic support and there was very deep anti Semitism in German society. That's irrefutable. But I think as time goes on, we do need to look at some of the grey areas a bit more. Um, when you look at these old archival footage, for example, from British Pathé, it's um, it's very triumphalist. So, for example, I've just watched a video on the bombing of Hamburg, and the voiceover is very cheery. It's like, "Ah, boys, give them a good run of the mill, and we are estimated to fatten." You know that old BBC English language. The old. It was very triumphalist. There's no question about it. And I've heard some people commenting that, "Oh, how could they do? How could they speak in that way?" Well, what I would say is it's no different from what German propaganda was doing with the bombing of British cities. Do you think Joseph Goebbels wasn't triumphalist when he heard about the bombing of Bristol or Coventry? Of course he was. So people need to understand this was a total war. And it annoys me a little bit when people bring standards of today into the context of a total war. Because you need to understand this was a fight for survival. It was a fight for national survival. You know, Thousands of our compatriots have been killed. British people were suffering in bombing raids, in rationing, with the real fear in 1940 that we could have been taken over by the Third Reich. There was all these factors, plus the deaths of servicemen. Um, so really, this needs to be understood that this was total war. So my attitude to this is that we do need to look at some of the nuances of it in a way that we didn't in the past. So if you look at, for example, cinema treatment of this, there was a film made recently. I didn't get around to seeing it, but it was called Allied. I think Keira Knightley was in it, and it was actually set in Hamburg immediately after the war. So they touched on it. The film Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, there's a scene where Staffenberg and his family are hiding in the basement of their house during an Allied air raid on, I believe it was Hamburg. Um, so we are starting to see the perspective of German people as well, and I've no issues with that. I don't think it's defending the Third Reich. I don't think it's downplaying the evil of that regime, but I've no problem with that aspect being told. I think it's something in the German psyche that, with both world wars, there is a real reticence on the German part to recognise their suffering. And this is understandable, especially in the case of World War II, because, you know, they do have a lot of guilt, and that should never ever be overlooked. Um, that's why subsequent German chancellors have been very, very careful on how they've approached this. I mean, for example, there is no sort of commemorations at German war cemeteries, even though in both world wars millions and millions of German servicemen died. In the case of the Second World War, they weren't all enthusiastic Hitler lovers. Many of them were, but it's a question of nuance. I mean, take for example the term the Nazi forces. Is that accurate, or is it better to just say the German army? Well, it's a difficult one that because they were fighting for the Third Reich. Whether they had a choice or not, they were fighting for the Third Reich. So in that sense, it's not technically inaccurate to say the Nazi forces. That does not mean the individual German soldiers were all supporters of the Third Reich. And there's many examples um, of German soldiers who actually done some quite noble things. And I'm not just talking about personal bravery, but I'm talking about there were examples, for instance, of German officers who shielded Jews. Um, Schindler's the famous one. He was a member of the party, but I mean actual German officers. And I've just seen a video of a Holocaust survivor who says she and her family probably survived because a German officer between Amsterdam and Antwerp actually covered for them when they were being asked for their documents to be handed over. So there are many personal examples of this which show that there are aspects of World War II that are not black and white. And I do think as time goes on, I've no problem with the suffering of German civilians being known and being documented, as long as it doesn't get into Germany being a victim. Germany was not a victim. The German people were victims, but Germany was not a victim. When I say they were victims, I mean they suffered. They're irrefutable, they did, just like Japanese civilians suffered. This is not to downplay what Germany and Japan done. And I do get quite angry when I see people saying that the British started the war on Germany. Um, this is incredibly, incredibly naive thinking, and it's profound revisionism in the wrong way because Britain was treaty bound to defend Poland. Germany was sweeping across Europe, you know. So the idea we could have just turned a blind eye to Hitler's ambitions, it's ludicrous. It's utterly, utterly ludicrous. How could we, 75 years later, have looked at the international community and said, oh, we were neutral in World War II? It's just ridiculous. So when people say Britain started the war on Germany, it's just absurd historical distortion of what the situation was at the time. Yes, we declared war on Germany, but It was necessary. It really, really was necessary. Um, I'll close this video with a few words on Dresden because can't escape that in this video. Now, the controversy with Dresden is that it was not a military city. It didn't have any major armaments. It wasn't a port, and yet we pulverized it, killed a lot of people in the process. And to this day, there are some neo-Nazis even within Germany who demand that it be recognized as an Allied war crime. My take on this is that there is some moral questions about the bombing of Dresden because it was less militarily significant than, say, for example, Hamburg. But I think we have to be very careful about making moral equivalencies between the Third Reich and the Allied powers, because I don't think there are any moral equivalencies. Yes, innocent civilians died at the hands of the RAF. By the way, let's not forget many brave RAF servicemen, many young men died as well. 55,000 British airmen died in World War II. That's another aspect we can't overlook. Um, but the bombing of Dresden, was it a war crime? Probably on balance it was. But I don't believe that we should apologize, and I don't believe that we should make moral equivalencies. Was it a war crime? Maybe it was, but it was in the context of total war. And that is what I think is so, so fundamental to this. Um, Maybe we should never have carried out that raid. I believe the raids on the other cities were justified because they were, um, Hamburg was a strategic port, for example, and many of the other cities were industrial cities producing armaments, Dresden less so. So it is difficult to really justify the bombing of Dresden. And even if you go with the argument, oh, well, the Germans bombed our civilians and cities that weren't militarily important, yeah, it is harder to defend that. But here's the thing. Um, it was total war. And I lost my trail of thought there. I was going to say something else. It was, yeah, lost my trail of thought. What I think we should do is, I don't think we should ever apologize because not only would that be inappropriate, given that Germany, you know, started the war, it's obvious, invaded Poland, it swept over Europe. Um, but I also think that it would ignore the. I really have lost my trail of thought now. That's irritating. Um, so basically, I think that we shouldn't be triumphalist. That's what I was going to say. Um, we can recognize it was necessary, but I don't, for example, think that we should dance about or glorify the deaths of German civilians. I see people saying that, oh, they deserved it. Well, not every German was a member of the Nazi Party. I really, really don't think that we should glorify that in any way, shape, or form. And I also think the mass rape of German women was abhorrent. But even Germany has largely, kept that as a silent thing. Because, if they brought it up, they were the Germans. The amount of civilian suffering they inflicted on Poland and Ukraine and Russia. Um, so it's this position that Germany's in that we were the Germans. We can't talk about how we suffered. And I'm not so sure that that's right. Those women were totally innocent. Surely they deserve a voice. There's even there's a lot of things that have happened in German society. For example, I didn't realize this. There was apparently a phenomenon. The I forget the German name, but the English translation is rubble women. These were women who apparently, after the war, were used by the Allies to clean up the rubble of German cities. And they kind of got a heroic status in post-war Germany. There's a lot of things about the German psyche post-war. I mean, for the British and Americans, there is no real psychological challenge because we were the victors. and we had the moral argument on our side. It was just war. So I don't think there's any deep moral questions, at least in the public mind, for the British and Americans, particularly not for the British, but for the Germans, it's a very, very complex thing, I believe, because their civilians suffered, and yet their government was one of the most evil regimes in history, responsible for the mass extermination of entire peoples, the violent conquest of a continent, the subjugation of millions upon millions of people. So I can understand why there's kind of a German reticence to talk about these things. Anyway, that's just my honest thoughts. This is always going to be a controversial subject, but I do think as time goes on, I personally am pleased that we are no longer, or we have less of this kind of anti-German sentiment in the UK, notwithstanding Brexit and all our issues with the EU. I think there's less of a, I would call it a dad's army mentality. And I mean that, well, I was going to say mean that respectfully, but it is a bit of a jibe because there was this mentality right up to the 70s of deep hatred of the German people. There was a kind of, there's a famous scene, of course, in Faulty Towers where it's very funny. I mean, it's good humor, but um, I do think there was a jingoism in Britain against all Germans, and I'm pleased that has gone now to a large extent because we cannot blame, for example, young Germans today. I heard an anecdote about a young German guy today, had nothing to do with World War II. And he went into a pub in the Netherlands in Rotterdam and he was given quite a rough time of it simply because he was German. But he's a young guy, nothing to do with World War II. I was very close to some Germans when I was at university. Good guys. We used to have beer all the time, and even they had a sort of war guilt. I remember, I don't know how the subject came up, but they said, "Oh, we know what we've done was terrible in World War II," and there was kind of this almost instinctive reaction, like we have to apologize. And I would say, "Look, I'm not asking for an apology. You guys weren't responsible for what happened." So it was, of course, the other side of it is there is the rise of the far right in Germany. And I think it's right that it's looked at with a great deal of concern. And I'll just touch on this briefly because I know this is a long video, but um, the rise of the AfD and some basically neo-Nazi groups has been justified as a response to the Islamization of Europe. Not my words, but definitely the Islamism that has been in Europe. Um, I mean, the mass rapes in Cologne on New Year's Eve a few years ago, issues like this, Merkel's policy, that is, in my opinion, the most disastrous thing of the Merkel chancellorship. It was profoundly stupid to let in so many people at once without any real vetting. Angela Merkel's not a stupid person, but it was one of the most reckless things her government done. Um, and it only bolstered the far right, unfortunately. And we have seen some real problems with this. There was the assassination of the mayor, Walter Lucas, um, by a neo-Nazi, I believe it was last year. There is a concerning rise of neo-nationalism in Europe. We must learn from history. That doesn't mean that there isn't legitimate criticism to be made of political correctness and governments turning a blind eye to Islamism, but I think we need to be very, very wary of what could happen. That's my thoughts. Thanks for watching.